Supposed biblical error. Did Jesus claim there was no seed smaller than the mustard seed? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus gives the parable of the mustard seed. But in Mark we read, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable shall we use for it? It is like a grain of mustard seed, which when sown on the ground is the smallest of all seeds on earth." Similarly, in Matthew we read, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." Critics claim this is evidence Jesus made an error, because today we know there are seeds smaller than mustard seeds. So why would Jesus claim the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds? The problem with this reasoning is it is being uncharitable and petty with Jesus' words. Jesus wasn't giving lessons on botany, but theology. This would be like if you said we're out of eggs, and I replied by saying, "What are you, stupid? There are plenty of eggs left on the planet. There are some down at your local grocery store." What I did was uncharitably take your statement wildly out of context. Obviously, in context, you're referring to the lack of eggs in your refrigerator, not the status of eggs across the whole planet. Context, characters, and intentions are all factors we take into consideration in everyday speech, and we reasonably understand we ought to take the most charitable interpretation of someone's words. Jesus was talking to the average Jewish peasant of his time, so why would the same principle not apply? In everyday speech, we often take the illocution of a sentence, not the locution. If you do not know, locution refers to the literal meaning of your words, whereas illocution refers to the intended meaning. If I said to the man next to me, "You're standing on my foot," the literal meaning of my words is describing the situation, but my intended meaning is for him to remove his foot from on top of mine. If I said there's a fire in the house, you understand the intended meaning of "get out of the house," not that I was stating someone had kindled a fire on a stove or in a hearth. And just like we accept this understanding when it comes to everyday speech, we should utilize it as well when it comes to the statements of Jesus. For example, we do not think Jesus was literally saying for people to get the logs out of their own eyes, or to amputate body parts. We recognize his intended meaning of teaching ethical and theological truths. Likewise, when it comes to the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus is not teaching botany, but using the mustard seed as an example to teach about the kingdom of God. More importantly, notice the context. It is a reference to seeds Jewish farmers would have been planting in that day. The smallest of all the seeds the farmer used was the mustard seed. In Matthew and Mark, we see Jesus is saying that the smallest of all the seeds that a farmer of that day was sowing in the ground was the mustard seed. This would be like me having a handful of quarters, nickels, and pennies, and saying the penny was the smallest coin, even though we know a dime is actually smaller than a penny. In the context of my statement, we know the penny would be the smallest in relation to the other coins. Likewise, in context, Jesus said the mustard seed is the smallest of what the average Jewish farmer of the day was sowing in the ground. Remember, the context is about seeds the farmer would be sowing, not all seeds everywhere on earth. As Craig Evans says, "The mustard seed is often cited, for its tiny size contrasts dramatically with the great size of the mustard plant, which becomes a shrub and if allowed becomes a small tree, large enough for birds to build nests." Had Jesus appealed to a seed that, in scientific terms, was truly the smallest seed or spore on earth, his hearers would have no idea what he was talking about. His appeal to the tiny mustard seed was understood and readily acknowledged as the smallest seed with which the people of his time and place were familiar. Again, Jesus has communicated clearly, invoking images and realities which were known to his contemporaries. John V. Miller and John M. Soden say, "We don't accuse him of error because the mustard seed is not the smallest seed known to man, but we acknowledge the cultural context and perspective of his hearers, as well as the proverbial status of the mustard seed." Some might try to argue Jesus says in Mark that it's the smallest of all the seeds on earth, but the Greek word can also refer to the land of the region, or merely the ground. It doesn't necessarily refer to the whole planet, and in context, since he's talking about farming, he's most likely referring to the ground. In reality, Jesus' parable must be taken in context. He didn't state the mustard seed was the smallest on all the planet, but the smallest of what the average Jewish farmer would sow in the ground. Just like if you say you're out of eggs, you mean there are no eggs in your refrigerator, not that there are no eggs on the planet. Jesus' reference is the seeds of the agriculture of ancient Judea. Thus, this supposed error can be resolved.